A millionaire returning from a trip finds twins abandoned on his doorstep. But what happens next is shocking. Victor Harrington stepped down from the private jet with steady steps, feeling the cold London wind caress his face. Next to him, Layla, his new girlfriend, was adjusting her designer jacket while observing her surroundings with a bored look. The return from a romantic getaway to Paris was supposed to mark the beginning of a new phase in Victor's life. Newly divorced and determined to live as he had always dreamed, free and untethered, he felt like a new man, believing that the worst was over. When he arrived at the entrance to his mansion in the elegant Kensington neighborhood, however, something unexpected caught his eye. A basket covered in a light blue blanket was resting on the front step. Victor's heart raced for a moment, and he approached with careful steps. Layla, distracted, cast a lazy glance in the direction of the object, snorting. "Please tell me this isn't what I'm thinking," she muttered, crossing her arms. Victor gently pulled back the blanket, revealing two children, twins sleeping peacefully. Their rosy, serene faces contrasted with the chill of the London night. Next to one of the babies, an envelope was hastily folded. He opened it with trembling hands and read the handwritten note. "Victor, take care of my babies. They're not to blame for anything. They need you. Please." Victor felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Layla, next to him, looked even more incredulous. "Is this a joke? Who would do that? You have to call the police," she said impatiently. Victor, however, couldn't move for a few moments. Something about that note struck him in a way he couldn't explain. He looked again at the little faces, and an avalanche of doubts began to form in his mind. "I can't just leave them here," he muttered, carefully picking up the basket and entering the house. Layla followed him, clearly annoyed. "Victor, that doesn't make sense. They're not your responsibility. You have no idea where they came from." But Victor wasn't listening. He put the basket on the sofa in the living room and watched the twins, trying to figure out what he should do. He barely knew how to change a diaper, let alone take care of two babies at once. The night was chaos. Between incessant crying, makeshift bottles full of ignored messages from Layla, her patience was at its limit. "I'm not a nanny. That's not what I came here for," she said, getting up from the sofa and grabbing her bag. "If that's what you want for your life, fine, but I'm out." Without waiting for an answer, she left the house, slamming the door. Victor stood still for a moment, trying to take it all in. The loneliness of that moment seemed overwhelming. He picked up the phone and, in a tired voice, called Sarah, his housekeeper, asking her to come early the next day. The next morning, Sarah arrived, worried by the tone of the call. As soon as she saw the twins in the basket, her eyes widened. "Mr. Harrington, what's going on here? Babies? Whose are they?" Victor handed her the note and sighed deeply. "I have no idea, Sarah. They were left on my doorstep." While they were talking, Sarah tidied up the blankets in the basket and found something else. It was a small bracelet with the names Ava and Liam engraved on it, accompanied by another piece of paper. She handed it to Victor, who opened it with trembling hands. The contents of the note were brief but devastating. "Ava and Liam Harrington. They need to know where they came from." Victor felt his blood run cold. Harrington, the same surname as his own. He looked at Sarah, but before he could say anything, the doorbell rang. He walked to the door, his head full of questions. When he opened it, he found a familiar figure standing there, someone he had never expected to see again. It was Charlotte, his ex-wife. Victor stared at Charlotte, breathing heavily. Her face was pale, but her eyes still had that intensity he knew so well. She was wearing a thick coat and her hands were trembling. She seemed hesitant, but determined. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice soft, almost inaudible. Without saying anything, he made way for her to enter. Charlotte looked around quickly, her eyes falling on the basket where Ava and Liam were. She smiled, but the expression soon gave way to a melancholy that Victor couldn't interpret. "I need to explain to you what's going on," she began, taking a seat on the sofa. "I don't know where to start, but I'll get straight to the point." Victor crossed his arms, trying to keep a firm posture, even though his heart was racing. "When we split up, I found out I was pregnant." She paused, watching his reaction. He froze, but said nothing. "At that time, you were so determined to break free, to live your life without compromises. I was so hurt that I decided not to tell you. I thought I could raise the children on my own." Charlotte sighed, running her hands through her hair. I went to Brighton. I started from scratch. But I can't do it alone anymore. Victor felt a growing weight. What do you mean? Why now, Charlotte? She lowered her gaze, hesitating before answering. I found out a few weeks ago that I'm ill. It's serious, Victor. I have a rare type of lymphoma. The treatment needs to be done in the United States, and I don't know if I'll survive. The silence in the room was overwhelming. Victor felt as if the floor had been ripped out from under his feet. So you just decided to leave them on my doorstep? His voice was a mixture of incredulity and restrained anger. I didn't know what to do, she replied, her voice rising for the first time. I was terrified. I thought of all the possibilities. But in the end, I realized that if anything happens to me, they have to be with you. You're their father, Victor. I don't want them to be orphans. Those words echoed in Victor's mind, leaving him stunned. He looked at Ava and Liam, who were now babbling, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. I have to travel in a week, Charlotte continued, her eyes brimming with tears. The treatment will take months, and I can't look after them during that time. I need you to take this on, Victor. For them. He ran his hands over his face, trying to process everything. Now that he was finally starting to enjoy single life, everything seemed to be falling apart. 2 babies. A terrible diagnosis. Her gigantic responsibility. Charlotte stood up, approaching the basket and stroking her children's little faces. They're all that matters to me. Please, Victor, they need you now. Before he could reply, the phone rang, cutting the moment short. Victor ignored it, but the persistent sound brought a strange sense of urgency. Something was changing fast, and he felt he had no control over anything. He looked at Charlotte, then at the children, and finally at the phone. Victor? Charlotte called him, her voice broken, as a silent tear ran down her cheek. He stared into the void, feeling the weight of a decision that would change his life forever. Victor hesitantly picked up the phone, the insistent sound breaking the heavy atmosphere in the room. When he answered, Layla's voice sounded clear and direct, but full of impatience. Victor, have you sorted this out? Please tell me you've handed those children over to the police. It's not your problem. He squeezed his eyes shut and rubbed his forehead, trying to organize his thoughts. Layla, things have changed. I can't take Ava and Liam to the police. The other line was silent for a few seconds. What do you mean you can't? Victor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the revelation. Because they are my children. On the other end of the line, Layla let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. Your children? What do you mean, Victor? You've never mentioned anything about children. Is that serious? It's serious, he replied, his voice low. Charlotte just told me. When we split up, she was pregnant and never said anything to me. Now she can't look after them. She has to travel to treat a serious illness. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy and cold. Finally, Layla spoke with a tone that mixed surprise and distance. That's a lot. I need some time to think. I need to process all this. Without waiting for an answer, she hung up. Victor stood still for a few seconds, staring at the muted phone in his hand, as if he was still waiting for her to call back. Charlotte, who was watching the conversation from afar, lowered her gaze and let out a small sigh. So you were already moving on, she muttered, her voice almost inaudible. Victor stared at her, surprised by her tone. Charlotte, it's not like that. She raised her hand to interrupt him, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't come here to complicate your life, Victor. I just want what's best for Ava and Liam, and now you know that they need you. Without saying another word, she picked up a bag she had left next to the basket. Inside were some documents, small clothes, and a photo album. Charlotte knelt down next to the babies, who looked at her curiously. My loves, she said, with tears shining in her eyes. I promise I'll do everything I can to come back, but until then, you're in good hands. You have the best father in the world. She kissed each of them, her voice breaking as she whispered words of farewell. When she finally stood up, her face was wet with tears. I have to go, she said to Victor, without facing him. She walked through the living room door with faltering steps, carefully closing it behind her. Victor stood motionless, while Sarah, the maid, stood beside him, equally stunned. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Mr. Harrington. Sarah began, but her voice faded. Victor just shook his head, his eyes fixed on the babies. The echo of the door closing still seemed to resonate in the silent mansion, like a symbol of the uncertain future that now lay ahead of them. The only thing clear to him at that moment was that his life would never be the same. Victor ran to the door, calling out to Charlotte in an embarrassed voice. "Charlotte, wait! Please!" She stopped for a moment, her back stiff and her body trembling. Slowly, she turned her face away, her watery eyes staring into his. For a moment, she seemed about to say something, but she bit her lip and looked away. "It's for the best, Victor. Don't make it any harder than it already is," she replied, her voice breaking. Before he could insist, she turned again and continued walking down the sidewalk. Victor stood at the entrance to the mansion, watching her walk away. The sound of her footsteps on the wet asphalt echoed, and he felt a crushing weight in his chest. He wanted to run after her, but he knew Charlotte was in too much pain to prolong this farewell. He closed the door slowly, returning to the living room where Sarah was still standing by the basket. Ava and Liam were babbling, oblivious to the emotional storm going on around them. Victor ran a hand through his hair, still trying to process everything. "Sarah, I need you now more than ever. I have no idea how I'm going to cope on my own." The housekeeper smiled tenderly, although she looked equally frightened. "I'm here, Mr. Harrington. We'll manage." Victor sat on the sofa, looking at the babies, who were now beginning to fuss. His mind was racing. He had to organize everything. He couldn't put off the inevitable. "I'll need to set up a room for them. Hire an experienced nanny. Talk to a lawyer to understand the legalities of it all. And, of course, cancel the trip to Scotland this weekend," he said, more to himself than to Sarah. Sarah nodded, already mentally listing the tasks she needed to take on. Victor picked up the phone again, still hoping to hear Layla's voice. But, like the last few times, she didn't answer. Later, while reviewing documents and sending messages to event organizers and interior designers to adapt the house, he received an unexpected call. It was Layla. "Layla, thank God you called. I was trying to reach you." On the other end of the line, her voice sounded distant, almost cold. "Victor, we need to talk. I've been thinking, and I can't be part of it. I'm young. I want to enjoy life. I don't want responsibilities with 2 children, even if you're a millionaire and can hire a whole team to deal with them." Victor felt a tightness in his chest, but tried to argue. "Layla, I'm not going to deal with this alone. I just need you with me. It's temporary." "It's not temporary, Victor," she interrupted. "It's your children. You'll be a father for the rest of your life, and that's not what I want for mine." Before he could reply, she continued, "You're amazing, but I need something different. Goodbye, Victor." The line went silent, leaving Victor alone with the deafening silence. He put the phone away, feeling reality crush him. "Mr. Harrington," said Sarah, approaching with a worried expression. "Is everything all right?" He looked at her and then at the babies. Ava was now holding Liam's finger, making a soft sound that caused an involuntary smile to appear on his face. "It's not okay, Sarah, but it will be," she replied. In that instant, Victor realized that there was no turning back. His life as a carefree bachelor was over. He had responsibilities, and as frightening as it was, he also felt for the first time that those 2 little lives could make sense of the emptiness he didn't even know he was carrying. Victor devoted the next few days to completely reorganizing his life. The world that had previously been centered on luxurious trips, parties with friends, and carefree evenings turned into something he had never imagined. He hired 2 nannies, one for the day shift and one for the night, redecorated one of the rooms in the mansion to turn it into a children's space, and filled the closets with clothes, toys, and everything Ava and Liam could possibly need. The house, once silent and impeccably organized, was now filled with cries, children's laughter, and the clutter of scattered toys. Victor hardly recognized his routine. The schedule of meetings with lawyers and financial planners had been adjusted to accommodate the children's schedules. Although everything was in order, he felt constant pressure. Sitting in the huge living room, phone in hand, he tried once more to call Layla. She hadn't answered for days, and he knew that the situation with the twins had driven her away for good. When she finally answered with a voice message, the confirmation was an unexpected blow. "Victor, I hope you understand. I don't want this life. I'm young, I want to enjoy it. And even with all your wealth, you'll still have responsibilities as a father. It's just not for me. Goodbye." He read the message once more before deleting it, feeling a mixture of frustration and resignation. "One more to go," he muttered to himself. As the days went by, Victor began to feel that he needed a break from his new reality. Although he was surrounded by competent professionals and his routine was apparently under control, he couldn't help feeling that his life had been taken over by something he still didn't fully understand. One evening, when everything seemed in order, and the children were under the care of the night nanny, Victor decided to go out. He needed a distraction, a moment to reconnect with the man he was before all this happened. The nightclub in central London was full, with flashing lights and deafening music that made the floor vibrate. Victor was surrounded by acquaintances and a few old friends, but his mind wandered. He drank slowly, pretending to enjoy the conversation, but something seemed out of place. As he stared at the bar, his phone vibrated in his pocket. At first he ignored it, but when the vibration insisted, he pulled out the device and saw that it was a call from the babysitter. A chill ran down his spine. He turned away from the music, trying to listen. "Mr. Harrington, it's Ava. She has a high fever, and nothing I've tried is working. It's very hot, and I think we need to take her to the hospital." Victor stopped breathing for a moment, feeling the world around him spinning. "How high is the fever?" he asked quickly, trying to stay calm. "Almost 40 degrees. I've already given the antipyretic, but it didn't work." "I'm going home now," he replied without thinking, hanging up immediately. He hurried out of the club, ignoring his friend's questions and the attempt by one of the women at his table to accompany him. He got into his car with his hands shaking and his heart racing. Although he knew that high fevers were common in children, the thought of something happening to Ava was unbearable. When he got home, he found the nanny holding Ava on her lap, the little girl restless and her eyes shining with fever. Without hesitating, he took his daughter in his arms. "We're going straight to the hospital. Is Liam all right?" he asked. "Yes, he's asleep," replied the nanny, grabbing a bag with Ava's belongings. On the way to the hospital, Victor could barely keep his eyes on the road. He looked at Ava, murmuring soft words to calm her down as anxiety consumed him. At that moment, he realized that it didn't matter how hard he had tried to distance himself from responsibility or reclaim his single life. All that now seemed insignificant in the face of the well-being of those little beings who depended on him. When he arrived at the hospital, he was relieved to see doctors taking control. As he waited for the diagnosis in the bright, quiet corridor, Victor realized that his life would never be the same. He was no longer the man who sought freedom at any cost. Now Ava and Liam were his priority, and he wouldn't allow anything to put them in danger again. The hospital was a sterile environment, illuminated by white lights that seemed to intensify every emotion. Victor sat beside Ava's small bed, watching her with a tightened heart. The doctor's diagnosis had been a relief. A common respiratory inflammation in children, nothing that indicated anything serious. The medication would be administered, and Ava would soon be home again. Even so, seeing his daughter so fragile, with her face pale and her eyes closed, affected him in a way he had never imagined possible. Ava didn't even have the strength to smile, and the sound of her heavy breathing echoed in Victor's mind as a cruel reminder of her vulnerability. He held her small hand, feeling the heat of the fever begin to subside. "You'll be fine," he whispered, more to himself than to the girl. As he waited in the hospital, every second seemed to stretch into an eternity. He thought about everything he had neglected in life, how he had been blind to what really mattered. Now, it wasn't just about Ava or Liam, it was about him. Something inside him was changing, a sense of responsibility that went beyond anything he had ever felt before. When they finally took Ava back home in the early morning, he put her in her crib, staying by her side until her breathing became lighter and quieter. Sarah found him sitting in the armchair next to the crib, his head resting in his hands. "Mr. Harrington, Miss Ava will be fine now. She just needs some rest. Perhaps you should rest too," suggested the maid with a careful tone. Victor nodded, but didn't leave Ava's side. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep. Over the next few days, as Ava slowly recovered, Victor realized that his life was, in fact, revolving around the children. He dedicated himself to being present, learning every detail of their routines. Calls from friends started piling up on his phone, insisting on invitations to trips, parties, and casual get-togethers. "You can't stay stuck there forever, Victor," one of his closest friends said during a call. "Let the nannies take care of it. Go back to being you." But he no longer saw himself as he used to. He politely declined every invitation, hanging up the phone with the feeling that that chapter of his life was behind him. One evening, while reviewing the emails he had accumulated, he saw a reminder of an old travel reservation that had been cancelled. On reflex, he began to plan how he could reorganize his time. But then he thought of Charlotte. It was a thought that had come to mind often lately. He wondered how she was doing, what the treatment was like in the United States, and whether she was coping with everything on her own. The memories of Charlotte, of the way she had faced everything with courage, didn't leave him alone. He remembered the tone of pain and determination in her voice when she handed Ava and Liam over to him. "She did it for both of them," he muttered to himself, squeezing his eyes shut as he held the phone. Without hesitation, he looked up her number in his contacts and pressed the call button. The ringing sounded longer than usual. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. But then the familiar, cautious voice came from the other end. "Victor?" "Charlotte," he answered, swallowing dryly. How are you? How's the treatment going?" There was a silence on the other side, and Victor could hear the sound of heavy breathing. Finally she answered, her voice shaking. "I'm doing well. Or at least I'm trying." Victor felt a knot forming in his throat. He wanted to ask more, but didn't know how to start. "Do you need anything? Help? Anything I can do?" Charlotte let out a small, humorless laugh. "Victor, I don't know if help is the right word, but there's something you need to know." Victor's heart raced. "What? Charlotte, what happened?" She paused for a long moment, the kind of silence that made time seem to stand still. "I can't talk right now, Victor. It's complicated, but I'll call you tomorrow, I promise." Before he could insist, the line went silent. Victor stood there, holding the phone against his chest, while an inexplicable restlessness took hold of him. Something in Charlotte's voice made him deeply worried, as if the next call might bring news that would change everything once again. The morning was cold, and the London sky seemed to reflect the weight on Victor's shoulders as he held the phone, anxiously awaiting Charlotte's return. Ever since the brief phone call the night before, something inside him hadn't left him alone. He wondered, with growing concern, what Charlotte needed to say, how serious the situation was that she had hinted at. When the phone finally rang, he picked it up before the second ring. Her voice, weaker and more hesitant than usual, immediately made him imagine a bleak scene. Charlotte alone, perhaps in a hospital bed somewhere far away. "Victor, thank you for seeing me so quickly," she began. He could hear the weight in every word, the effort to sound firm despite his vulnerability. "Charlotte, you don't have to thank me. Talk to me, please. What's going on?" "You said there was something important," he replied, the tension evident in his voice. She took a deep breath, and for a moment, all he heard was the sound of her irregular breathing. "The treatment is going on," he began, his voice choppy. "But it's long, Victor. Long and expensive. The costs are immense, even with insurance, and I don't know if I can cope with it all on my own." Victor felt a pang in his chest. He could imagine how difficult it was for Charlotte to admit this, to ask for help. Always so independent, so proud. Even when they were married, she preferred to sort things out on her own. Now hearing this confession made him realize how difficult the situation really was. "Charlotte, you're not alone," he said quickly with determination. "I can help, whether financially or in any other way, whatever you need. Don't hesitate to ask." "I knew you'd say that," she replied, with a small nervous laugh that soon turned into an emotion-laden sigh. "But it's not just about the money, Victor. It's more than that." "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice lower, as if he were bracing himself for the impact of something bigger. Charlotte paused for a long moment, and he could almost imagine the tears rolling silently down her face. "I need you to look after the children, Victor. I need to know that they're okay, that they have you by their side in case I can't get through this." Those words hit Victor like a blow. He felt the air escape from his lungs, his eyes stinging with tears that he struggled to hold back. For a moment the phone went silent, and all he could hear was the echo of her words in his mind. "Charlotte." He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. Clearing his throat, he tried again. "You know I'm looking after them. I'm doing everything I can." "I know, Victor," she replied, her voice breaking. "But I need to hear it from you. I need to know that you're going to be there for them, that you're going to be more than a provider, that you'll be the father they need, the man I know you can be." Victor closed his eyes, memories swirling through his mind like a whirlwind. He flashed back to when he first met Charlotte, the days of youth when everything seemed so simple. She had been his first girlfriend, his best friend. They had grown up together, sharing dreams, fears, and achievements. He remembered their first kiss, in a park illuminated by the sunset, when she laughed and said he tasted like strawberry chewing gum. They had always been accomplices, united. But over time, Victor's ambition and desire to explore the world took over. He wanted more adventures, more experiences, more freedom. When the money started rolling in, bringing with it a new lifestyle, he believed he was destined for something greater. Charlotte, with her tranquility and attachment to home, seemed to be an obstacle to the dreams of a young millionaire thirsty for novelty. It was this hunger for freedom that led him to ask for a divorce, not because he didn't love her, but because he believed he needed something different. Now, sitting alone in his huge mansion, with the echoes of her words still ringing in his ears, he wondered how he had been able to abandon her. "Victor, are you there?" Her voice brought him back to the present. "I'm here," he replied, his voice firmer now. "Please think about it. I'm not asking for myself. I'm asking for them." He looked at the photo on the table, a recent image of Ava and Liam smiling amidst a sea of toys. It was impossible to deny that, since they had come into his life, something inside him was changing. He was no longer the same man who sought parties and fun at any cost. And now, as Charlotte waited for his answer, he realized that he was facing a choice that would define not only their future, but his own. Victor took a deep breath, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. He needed to decide. And when silence settled between them again, Charlotte whispered, almost as if she didn't want him to hear, "I still believe in you, Victor, even after everything." He closed his eyes, the tears finally falling. Then he made a decision. Victor spent a sleepless night after his conversation with Charlotte. He couldn't get out of his head the fragile tone of her voice, the weight of her words, the request that felt like a last act of trust. Try as he might, there was no escaping what had to be done. In the silence of the early morning, with the cold wind beating against the windows of his mansion, he made a decision that could change everything. He would go to the United States. He needed to see her, to look into her eyes and understand the gravity of the situation. And there was something else. He wanted Charlotte to see Ava and Liam. Perhaps seeing her children would give her new strength to fight. The next morning, he began to organize everything. He hired an agency to take care of the details of the trip and made it clear that he would be taking the children and the nannies. Although he knew it would be complex logistically, he saw no other alternative. He didn't trust leaving Ava and Liam behind. Besides, he wanted them to be close by, even if they couldn't enter the hospital. During the days of preparation, Victor felt the weight of responsibility like never before. He went over every detail of the trip with the nannies, making sure they had everything they needed for the children's well-being during the long journey. Strollers, toys, extra clothes, medication, nothing was left to chance. When the day of departure arrived, Victor looked at the huge suitcase and then at the children. Ava and Liam were in the nanny's arms, oblivious to the intensity of the moment. Despite all the planning, he knew that traveling with 2 babies would be a challenge. But nothing could prepare him for what he would face on the flight. In first class, he settled in with the nannies and the children, trying to maintain an air of calm. But it wasn't long before the journey began to get complicated. The plane's enclosed environment made Ava and Liam uneasy. First, it was Ava, who started crying non-stop, refusing to stay on the nanny's lap. Then Liam joined in, as if his sister's discomfort was contagious. Victor tried to calm them down, rocking them in his arms, offering toys and even walking down the aisle. But nothing seemed to work. He felt the stares of other passengers, some impatient, others sympathetic, and tried to ignore their growing embarrassment. "Mr. Harrington, perhaps you should try feeding them again," suggested one of the nannies in desperation. Victor nodded and did his best to improvise a moment of comfort, but the crying seemed endless. He felt sweat collecting on his forehead and realized how much he still needed to learn about caring for children. For a moment, he had a twinge of doubt about his decision, but when they finally landed, He felt a mixture of relief and renewed determination. They were in the United States. Now he had to find Charlotte. At the hotel, he left the children in the care of the nannies, making sure everything was in order before leaving. The hospital was only a few kilometers away, but the journey seemed endless. On the way, Victor stared out of the cab window, lost in thought. He didn't know what to expect when he saw her. There was something in her voice on the last call that made him uneasy, as if she was hiding something. When he arrived at the hospital, the cold clinical atmosphere welcomed him with a heavy air. He passed through reception, identified himself, and was taken by a nurse to Charlotte's room. Each step seemed more difficult than the last, and his heart beat faster as he approached the door. As he entered, Victor saw Charlotte lying on the bed, pale and thinner than he remembered. Her eyes lit up at the sight of him, but the smile she tried to muster was fragile. He felt a lump in his throat as he realized how weak she looked. "Victor," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. "You came." "Of course I came," he replied, approaching the bed. "I had to come. How are you?" Charlotte hesitated for a moment before answering. "I'm resisting. The treatment is aggressive, but they say there's still hope. It's all so uncertain." Victor sat down next to her, holding her hand. For the first time in a long time, he felt Charlotte's vulnerability in a way that disconcerted him. He remembered the strong, determined woman he had married, and seeing how the disease had transformed her appearance and energy was almost unbearable. "You're not alone, Charlotte. I'm here. And so are Ava and Liam. They're in the hotel now, but I wanted you to know that we're all in this together." Hearing her children's names, Charlotte closed her eyes, letting a few tears escape. "Are they all right?" "They're fine. Ava had a bit of a scare, but she's recovered, and Liam is messier than ever," he said, trying to bring a little levity to the moment. Charlotte laughed softly, but the tired look soon returned to her face. "Thank you, Victor. Thank you for looking after them. That means everything to me." He squeezed her hand tighter, his eyes fixed on hers. "They're my children, Charlotte. It's my duty, and I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you're okay too." Her gaze met his, and for a moment, the silence between them seemed to say more than any words. Victor knew there was a lot to be said, a lot of wounds to be healed, but at that moment, all that mattered was the present. As the conversation continued, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that Charlotte was hiding something else. There was a shadow of concern on her face that he couldn't decipher. Something was yet to come, and he needed to be prepared. Victor was still sitting next to Charlotte, feeling the weight of her fragility as she fell asleep. The cold white light of the hospital room made her skin look even paler, almost translucent. He held her hand carefully, as if he feared that a sudden movement might break it. His eyes were fixed on her, but his mind wandered through a whirlwind of thoughts. Suddenly the door opened softly, and a doctor walked in. He was wearing an impeccably white coat and had a professional but clearly empathetic expression. Victor stood up immediately, trying to hide the emotion that was already building up in his eyes. "Mr. Harrington, I'm Dr. Williams. I'm looking after Miss Charlotte's case. Can we talk for a moment?" Victor nodded, casting a brief glance at Charlotte, who was still sleeping peacefully, and followed the doctor into the corridor. Each step seemed to weigh a ton, and he felt a growing anxiety, as if he was about to hear something that would change everything, yet again. As soon as they stopped in a reserved area, Williams looked at him seriously, but with a compassionate tone. "Mr. Harrington, I know this is a difficult situation, and I'd like to be as clear as possible about Miss Charlotte's condition. As you may know, she is suffering from an aggressive type of lymphoma. Although initial treatment has stabilized part of the condition, the cancer has shown resistance to some of the approaches. Right now, the absolute priority is to find a compatible donor for a bone marrow transplant." Victor felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The gravity of those words hit him like a dry blow. He tried to keep his composure, but his voice faltered as he asked, "And is there any progress? Any possibilities?" "We're looking at international and national donor banks," the doctor explained. "But finding a compatible donor can take time, and unfortunately, time is not in our favor. The transplant is the best chance she has of overcoming this." Victor shook his head slowly, absorbing each word as if he were trying to translate a language he didn't understand. His mind began to run in circles, thinking of everything he could do, all the possibilities. "I'll do whatever it takes," he finally said, with a firmness that surprised even himself. "Money, connections, whatever. If there's anything that can speed up this process, I want to know about it." The doctor gave a small smile of understanding. "Financial help can certainly make some things easier, but in the end it's about finding genetic compatibility. We can start by testing family members to see if there is a donor among the next of kin. You, for example, can be tested. It's a simple and quick process." Victor nodded vigorously. "Do it now. Today, if possible. I'll do anything." Williams placed a comforting hand on Victor's shoulder. "I understand your determination, Mr. Harrington. Let's organize the test right away and hope we can move forward." Victor returned to his room with a heavy heart, but full of determination. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew he wouldn't stand idly by. Charlotte was still asleep, her chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. He approached her silently, pulling out a chair and sitting down again beside the bed. As he watched her, his mind took him back to the past. Images of Charlotte laughing, full of life, dancing awkwardly around the living room of the first house they shared after their wedding, invaded his thoughts. He remembered the day they had argued about a trip he wanted to take with his friends, and how she, with tears in her eyes, had said that she just wanted him to choose her for once. At the time, he hadn't understood what that meant. Now, sitting there, seeing her so vulnerable, he realized that she had always chosen him. A silent tear trickled down Victor's cheek, but he didn't move to wipe it away. He allowed himself to feel the pain, regret, and love that still bound him to her. He had spent so long chasing a life he thought he wanted, but now he wondered if he had the courage to lose what really mattered. The room was silent, except for the soft sound of the heart monitor. Victor looked at Charlotte's hand and held it again, feeling the delicacy of her skin against his. For the first time in years he felt fear, a deep, paralyzing fear that she was no longer there. As he sat there watching her sleep, he promised himself that he would do whatever it took, not just to save Charlotte, but to repair everything that had broken between them. Victor left the hospital, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. The compatibility test had been carried out, and now all that remained was to wait for the results. He got into the cab that would take him back to the hotel and looked out of the window, the city lights passing by in a blur. The silence in the car seemed to amplify the chaos inside him. As determined as he was to do everything necessary, the fear of what might happen to Charlotte consumed him. When he arrived at the hotel, he was greeted by the nannies, who seemed relieved to see him. Ava and Liam were in their cribs, sound asleep. He entered the children's room and watched them for a long time. Their light, calm breathing contrasted with the storm of emotions he was carrying. "You have no idea how much all this is changing, Dad," he murmured, feeling a mixture of love and responsibility that, until recently, he hadn't believed he was capable of experiencing. After making sure the children were all right, Victor went to his own room. Physical and emotional exhaustion hit him like a wave, but even though he was exhausted, he knew that sleep wouldn't come easily. Charlotte's pale face kept appearing in his mind. Every detail of that hospital visit tormented him. Her tired expression, the doctor's words, the uncertain wait. He threw himself on the bed, but couldn't erase the feeling of helplessness. The next few days passed like a blur. Victor went to the hospital every morning, spent hours by Charlotte's side, and returned to the hotel in the evening. The nannies kept up the children's routine, but he made a point of spending time with them before bed, even if it was just holding them in his arms for a few minutes. Finally, the day came when the hospital called. The doctor asked him to come and talk about the test results. The drive to the hospital was fraught with tension. Every second seemed like an eternity, and his mind oscillated between hope and fear. When he arrived, Dr. Williams was waiting for him with a serious but reassuring expression. "Mr. Harrington, I have good news," said the doctor, handing him a document. "You're a match." Victor sat still for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. When the words finally made sense, he let out a deep sigh as if he had been holding his breath for days. His eyes filled with tears, and he brought his hands to his face, allowing himself to cry. "Thank you," he whispered over and over, as if he were talking to the universe. The doctor put his hand on his shoulder. "This is excellent news, but we still have a long way to go. We need to start preparing for the surgery." Victor nodded, wiped away his tears, and took a deep breath. I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes. When he returned to Charlotte's room, he found her awake, leafing through a book with little attention. As soon as he entered, she looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and tiredness. "What is it?" she asked, noticing something different in his expression. Victor sat down next to her and took her hand. "Charlotte, I'm compatible." She was paralyzed for a few seconds, her eyes fixed on his, as if trying to understand what this meant. "Are you serious?" "Yes," he replied with a sincere smile. "The doctor confirmed it. I can help you." Charlotte put her hands to her face, and he realized she was crying. When she finally spoke, her voice was broken. "Victor, I don't even know what to say. I don't know how to thank you." "No need to thank me," he interrupted. "You're not alone, Charlotte. We're in this together." For the first time in a long time, a genuine smile lit up her face. It was a shy smile, almost hesitant but full of hope. Seeing that sparkle in her eyes made Victor's heart fill with something he hadn't felt for years: purpose. The next few days were a flurry of preparations, additional tests, meetings with the medical team, discussions about risks and recovery. Victor was determined and involved in every detail, ensuring that everything was done in the best possible way. He even called his lawyer in London to organize any necessary documents, making sure he was fully prepared for any eventuality. Finally, the day of the surgery was scheduled. Victor was by Charlotte's side when the doctors entered the room to inform her. She held his hand tightly as she listened to the instructions. "I'm ready," she said, with a firmness in her voice that surprised even the medical team. Victor looked at her, amazed at the strength she showed even in the face of such an overwhelming situation. "And so am I." As the doctors left for their final preparations, Charlotte looked at Victor, her expression charged with emotion. "Thank you for being here, Victor. For everything. You have no idea how much this means to me." Victor squeezed her hand, feeling the connection between them grow even stronger. "I'm here, Charlotte. I always will be." The day of the surgery was a milestone, but also the beginning of a new stage full of uncertainties and challenges. Victor waited anxiously in the waiting room, his hands intertwined and his gaze fixed on the floor. He hardly felt any time passing, lost in thoughts about Charlotte, about everything they had faced up to that point, and about the future that still awaited them. When the doctor finally appeared, he explained that the surgery had gone well, but that the next few days would be crucial in determining whether Charlotte's body would accept the bone marrow. Over the next few days, Victor stayed at the hospital, sometimes at Charlotte's side, sometimes in the small makeshift room that had become his remote office. He divided his time between caring for the twins at the hotel and his daily visits to the hospital. Even with the nannies helping out, he made a point of being there so that Ava and Liam could feel his attention. He didn't want the emotional distance that had once marked his relationship with Charlotte to be repeated with his children. Charlotte, however, was facing an arduous recovery. The first 48 hours after the transplant were particularly difficult. She suffered from severe nausea, intermittent fevers, and a weakness so profound that she could barely keep her eyes open for long. Victor spent hours by her side, holding her hand, murmuring words of encouragement and trying to keep hope alive. "It's normal, Mr. Harrington," explained Dr. Williams in one of his daily updates. "The body is adjusting to the new marrow. These symptoms are to be expected and are part of the process. We need to monitor everything closely, but I'm optimistic." Despite the doctor's words, every moan of pain from Charlotte made Victor feel helpless. He wished he could ease her suffering, change places, do anything to speed up her recovery. During the nights while she slept, he would sit by her bedside watching her breathing, slow and irregular, and wondering how someone so strong and determined could seem so fragile at that moment. "You're the bravest woman I've ever met, Charlotte," he whispered one night, holding her hand. "I'll never let you go through this alone, never again." The days turned into a routine of anxiety and waiting. Each test, each preliminary result, was an emotional roller coaster. Finally, after a week that seemed interminable, Dr. Williams entered the room with a smile on his face that Victor immediately saw as a good sign. Charlotte was awake, leaning against pillows, still visibly weak, but more alert than she had been in days. Victor quickly got up from the chair next to the bed, his eyes fixed on the doctor. "I have good news," Williams began, with an encouraging tone. "The latest tests show that Charlotte's body is responding extremely well to the transplant. There has been no rejection, and everything indicates that the bone marrow is working as it should. This is a big step. With a few more weeks of follow-up, I think we'll be able to talk about discharge and full recovery." Victor brought a hand to his face, feeling an overwhelming wave of relief and gratitude. He let out a shaky sigh before turning to Charlotte, who was now crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she tried to process the news. Am I going to be okay?" she asked, her voice weak but full of emotion. "Yes, Miss Charlotte," confirmed the doctor. "Everything indicates that you will make a full recovery." Victor couldn't contain his emotion. He approached the bed and hugged her gently, taking care not to hurt her. Charlotte returned the embrace, squeezing him with what little strength she had, while they both cried in silence. "You did it, Charlotte," he said, his voice breaking. "You're incredible. And I promise from the bottom of my heart that I'll take care of you for the rest of my life." Charlotte smiled, still crying, but this time the smile was full of hope, something that hadn't been seen on her face for a long time. "Victor, you've already done so much. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me. Just promise me you'll keep fighting," he replied, holding her face in his hands and looking into her eyes. The following days were marked by steady progress. Charlotte gradually began to regain her strength, and the sparkle that Victor had always loved in her eyes began to return. He continued to divide his time between the hospital and the hotel, but with renewed confidence that all the effort was paying off. Many months had passed since Victor had arrived in the United States. He was exhausted, but he had never felt so alive. Working remotely, he managed to keep his business running, but he realized that his priorities had changed drastically. The man who once valued travel, parties, and unrestricted freedom now found purpose in the simplest moments, like playing with his children or holding Charlotte's hand while she read. As he looked out of the hotel window one night, with Ava and Liam sleeping peacefully, Victor reflected on everything that had happened. He knew that life would never be the same again, and that was something he finally accepted with joy. The day of Charlotte's discharge dawned with a clear sky, as if even the universe wanted to celebrate the moment. Victor had been at the hospital since early morning, taking care of every detail to ensure that nothing got in the way of her leaving. After 8 months of uncertainty, anguish, and pain, this was the beginning of a new stage, and he wanted everything to be perfect. Charlotte was sitting up in bed, wearing a simple outfit that contrasted with the hospital environment that had become her prison over the last few months. Although she was still thin and pale, there was a renewed sparkle in her eyes. A shy smile lit up her face as she tidied her hair with trembling hands. "Ready to get out of here?" asked Victor, entering the room with a bouquet of flowers. Charlotte looked at him, and for a moment couldn't answer. Tears began to roll down her cheeks before she shook her head in the affirmative. "Ready," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. Victor handed her the flowers and held her hand, helping her up. It was a simple moment, but full of meaning. Charlotte felt the warmth of his hand a constant throughout her illness. He had never abandoned her, even when she herself had almost given up hope. As she left the hospital, the fresh air wrapped around her like a hug. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaled deeply, and felt a freedom she hadn't experienced for a long time. Victor watched her every move, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "There's one more surprise waiting for you," he said with an enigmatic smile as he helped her into the car. During the drive to the hotel, Charlotte was visibly anxious. She knew what was waiting for her, but her heart was still racing. During the 8 months he had been away, Victor had made a point of keeping her image alive in the children's minds. He would show them pictures of Charlotte, point to his cell phone during video calls and say, "That's Mommy." The twins, even so small, recognized his presence through these interactions. When they arrived at the hotel, Victor led her to the room where the children were. Before opening the door, he stopped and looked at her. "Are you ready to meet the 2 little tornadoes who have changed my life?" he joked, trying to ease the tension. Charlotte laughed softly, but her eyes were watery. "I've never been so ready for anything in my life." Victor opened the door, and the sound of children's laughter filled the hallway. Ava and Liam were sitting on the floor with toys scattered around them. As soon as they noticed Victor, they looked at him with shining eyes, but it was Charlotte's presence that immediately caught their attention. For a moment, the twins remained motionless, as if they were processing who this woman was. Then, almost at the same time, Ava stood up and staggered toward Charlotte, while Liam followed close behind. "Mommy?" said Ava in a sweet voice, her arms outstretched. Charlotte collapsed on the floor, unable to hold back her tears. She opened her arms and Ava threw herself into them, followed by Liam. The three of them stayed there, hugging each other, while Charlotte cried uncontrollably, holding her children to her chest. "My babies, my loves, I've missed you so much," she whispered between sobs, kissing each of their hair. Victor, who was watching the scene leaning against the wall, felt his eyes fill with tears. He knew how much that moment meant to Charlotte, and seeing the twins so happy made him realize that everything they had been through had been worth it. Ava and Liam spoke at the same time, disconnected words full of excitement as they showed off their toys and tried to recount the adventures they had experienced with their father. Charlotte listened attentively, laughing and crying at the same time, soaking up every second of that dreamlike reunion. Later, when the children finally fell asleep, exhausted from playing and being emotional, Charlotte and Victor sat side by side on the sofa in the bedroom. "I don't even know how to thank you for everything you've done, Victor," she said, looking at him sincerely. "There's nothing to thank you for," he replied, holding her hand. "You're the mother of my children. You're more than that. You're the person who showed me what really matters in life." Charlotte looked at him, surprised by his words, and saw in his eyes something she had long thought she had lost: love. "I thought it was over between us," she confessed, "that you could never forgive me for hiding Ava and Liam." Victor shook his head. "Charlotte, I was a fool in the past, but you gave me something I never knew I needed. Those months were the hardest of my life, but also the most meaningful. I see everything clearly now." They were silent for a moment, their hands intertwined until Victor broke the silence. "Charlotte, I want to be by your side, not just as the father of our children, but as the man I should always have been to you." Charlotte felt her heart race. She knew that their path had been full of obstacles and heartaches, but at that moment, there was no doubt that they were exactly where they should be. With tears in her eyes, she nodded, and Victor pulled her into a tight hug. Later that day, the family dined together for the first time in months. Victor and Charlotte laughed as Ava and Liam made a mess of the food, their childish voices filling the room with life. It was a simple moment, but full of meaning. Charlotte looked around the table and felt her heart fill with gratitude. Despite everything, they were together, a family finally united. If you were moved by this story and want to follow more incredible content like this, watch the video that's appearing on your screen now and immerse yourself in yet another heartwarming story. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video.